What if I told you that in 1973, a mathematics professor at Thornfield University literally vanished while teaching a class of 32 students? Not walked out, not collapsed, not simply disappeared from campus. He stepped backward into his blackboard and never returned. The official records were sealed. The witnesses were sworn to silence. The room was permanently closed. But today, 50 years later, the truth finally emerges from the shadows of academic cover-ups and bureaucratic nightmares. This is the story of Professor Edmund Hartwell, and the day reality itself seemed to bend around his final lesson. October 15th, 1973, Thornfield University, a small liberal arts college nestled in the mountains of Vermont. Professor Edmund Hartwell had been teaching advanced calculus for 12 years. Students described him as brilliant but eccentric, the kind of man who would stare at equations for hours as if they were speaking to him in whispers only he could hear. But something had changed in Professor Hartwell. During the weeks leading up to that October afternoon, students noticed he had begun writing increasingly complex formulas that seemed to serve no educational purpose. Equations that sprawled across multiple blackboards, filled with symbols that didn't appear in any textbook. Sarah Morrison, one of his students, later recalled in a sealed deposition that the professor had become obsessed with what he called dimensional mathematics. He spoke of numbers that existed between numbers, of spaces that occupied the same location as other spaces, of mathematical truths that the human mind wasn't equipped to understand. The university administration received several complaints about Professor Hartwell's behavior. Parents worried their children weren't learning calculus but rather being exposed to what some called mathematical mysticism. The department chair, Dr. Robert Klein, scheduled a meeting with Hartwell for October 16th to discuss his teaching methods. That meeting would never happen. October 15th began like any other Monday. Professor Hartwell's advanced calculus class was scheduled for 2 p.m. in room 317 of the mathematics building. 32 students filed into the classroom, unaware they were about to witness something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. According to witness testimonies collected by private investigator Marcus Chen in 1998, Professor Hartwell seemed different that day, more focused, almost excited. He had covered every inch of the blackboard with equations before the students arrived. The formulas were unlike anything they had seen before, featuring mathematical symbols that seemed to shift and change when you weren't looking directly at them. Today, Professor Hartwell announced, "We're going to explore the true nature of mathematical space." He gestured toward the blackboard with an enthusiasm that made several students uncomfortable. Mathematics isn't just a tool for calculation, it's a doorway. And today, I'm going to show you what lies on the other side. For the first 20 minutes of class, Hartwell taught normally, explaining basic calculus concepts. But then he began incorporating the strange equations he had written on the board. He spoke of inverted integers and recursive dimensions. Students frantically tried to take notes, but many later reported that their pens refused to write certain symbols, as if the ink itself rejected the mathematical concepts. Then Professor Hartwell began to teach while facing the blackboard. This wasn't unusual. Many professors did this while writing. But as the minutes passed, students noticed something disturbing. Hartwell seemed to be getting closer to the blackboard, even though he wasn't moving his feet. Student Michael Reeves described it as watching someone sink into thick mud, except the professor was sinking backward into solid slate. At first, it was subtle. Hartwell's shoulders seemed to press against the blackboard surface. Then his head began to disappear into the dark stone. "Professor," called out Jennifer Walsh from the third row, but Hartwell continued teaching, his voice becoming increasingly muffled as more of his body merged with the blackboard. The equations he had written seemed to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with his increasingly distant words. "The beauty of dimensional mathematics," his voice echoed from within the blackboard, "is that space is merely a suggestion. Reality is far more flexible than we imagined." By this point, only Professor Hartwell's legs were visible, protruding from what should have been solid stone. Several students had begun to scream. Others sat frozen in their seats, unable to process what they were witnessing. Then, with a sound that witnesses described as something between a whisper and a thunderclap, Professor Hartwell's legs disappeared completely into the blackboard. The strange equations began to fade, leaving only clean, empty slate behind. The room fell into absolute silence. 32 students stared at a blackboard that now showed no trace of the complex formulas or their professor. It was as if Edmund Hartwell had never existed. Within minutes, university security arrived, followed by local police, then federal agents whose identities were never disclosed. The students were separated, interviewed individually, and required to sign non-disclosure agreements, under threat of academic expulsion and legal prosecution. The official story was simple. Professor Hartwell had suffered a mental breakdown and fled the campus. A body was never found because there was no body to find. The professor had simply disappeared in the most literal sense possible. But the cover-up went deeper than anyone realized. In 2003, construction workers renovating the mathematics building discovered a hidden room behind Professor Hartwell's old classroom. The room contained hundreds of notebooks filled with the same bizarre equations that had covered the blackboard that day. More disturbing was what they found on the walls of this hidden chamber. Scratch marks, deep gouges in the stone that spelled out mathematical formulas and, in some places, desperate messages. The numbers go deeper than we thought. Space is an illusion. I can see them on the other side. Carbon dating revealed the scratch marks had been made over a period of months, ending approximately on October 15, 1973. But Professor Hartwell had never had access to this hidden room. The entrance had been sealed since the building's construction in 1950-8. The university immediately resealed the room and classified its contents. But rumors persisted among the faculty. Some claimed they could hear scratching sounds from within the mathematics building's walls on quiet nights. Others reported seeing equations appearing and disappearing on blackboards throughout the department. Dr. Lena Bus, a quantum physicist who joined Thornfield's faculty in 1985, spent years investigating the Hartwell disappearance. Her research suggested that Professor Hartwell might have discovered something he called mathematical reality. The theory proposed that complex mathematical concepts could, under specific conditions, alter the fundamental nature of space and time. According to Dr. Vasquez's notes, which were discovered after her own mysterious disappearance in 1991, Hartwell's equations weren't just mathematical formulas, they were instructions. A recipe for stepping outside conventional three-dimensional space into what she termed numerical dimensions. But if Professor Hartwell had succeeded in entering these numerical dimensions, where had he gone? And more importantly, had he gone willingly? In 2007, paranormal investigator David Chen interviewed 6 of the surviving students from that October afternoon. Now in their 50s, these individuals had spent decades trying to forget what they witnessed, but their stories remained remarkably consistent. All 6 reported experiencing strange phenomena since that day. Mathematical equations would appear in their peripheral vision. Blackboards in their own homes or offices would occasionally show faint traces of the formulas Professor Hartwell had written. Some claimed they could still hear his voice, muffled and distant, continuing his lecture from somewhere beyond conventional reality. Most disturbing was the testimony of former student Rebecca Torres, who had become a mathematics professor herself. She claimed that on certain nights, while working alone in her office, she would find new equations written on her blackboard in handwriting she recognized as Professor Hartwell's. The equations were always more advanced than anything she had seen before, showing mathematical concepts that seemed to evolve and improve over time, as if someone was still learning and developing these ideas decades after their disappearance. "It's like he's still teaching," Torres whispered during her interview. "Still exploring, still discovering things in whatever dimension he found, and sometimes, I think he's trying to teach us, trying to show us the way to follow him." The most chilling piece of evidence emerged in 2012, when digital renovation of Thornfield's archives uncovered Professor Hartwell's final research notes. Hidden in his office desk, sealed in an envelope marked for my successor, were detailed instructions for what he called dimensional transition. The notes described a precise mathematical process for stepping outside normal spacetime. They included warnings about the dangers of incomplete transitions, descriptions of mathematical entities that existed in numerical dimensions, and most eerily, a detailed account of what Hartwell expected to find on the other side. According to these notes, Professor Hartwell believed that advanced mathematical concepts weren't just abstract ideas, but living entities existing in their own dimensional space. He theorized that sufficiently complex equations could serve as doorways, allowing conscious beings to enter these mathematical realities and interact directly with numerical concepts. The final entry in his research notes, dated October 14, 1973, reads, "Tomorrow, I will attempt full transition. If successful, I will have proved that consciousness can exist independently of physical space, sustained by pure mathematical truth. If unsuccessful, at least I will have tried to touch the face of absolute reality." Below this entry, written in different ink, are the words, "The transition was successful. The teaching continues. Mathematics is alive, and it is beautiful beyond human understanding." Handwriting analysis could never determine who wrote these final lines. Today, room 317 remains sealed. Thornfield University claims it's due to structural concerns, but maintenance records show the room is in perfect condition. Students report that on quiet afternoons, if you press your ear to the door, you can still hear the faint sound of chalk on Blackboard and a distant voice explaining concepts that no human textbook has ever contained. Professor Edmund Hartwell achieved what he sought. He stepped outside conventional reality and entered a dimension where mathematics itself is alive. Whether he did so voluntarily or was pulled into something beyond his understanding remains unknown. But perhaps the most disturbing question isn't where Professor Hartwell went, but whether he's still trying to return. Because according to the students who witnessed his disappearance, his final words, echoing from within the blackboard as his body vanished completely, were not a goodbye. They were an invitation. "Class dismissed," his voice whispered from beyond the slate. "But remember, mathematics is everywhere. And now, so am I." The official records state that Professor Edmund Hartwell suffered a mental breakdown and fled Thornfield University on October 15, 1973. But 32 witnesses saw something far more extraordinary and terrifying. They watched a man discover that reality itself is far more flexible than we dare to imagine. And sometimes, late at night, in mathematics departments around the world, professors working alone have reported finding new equations on their blackboards, complex formulas that seem to teach themselves, growing more sophisticated each time they appear. Equations signed with the initials EH, and accompanied by a simple message, "The lesson continues." So the next time you see a mathematics professor standing just a little too close to their blackboard, or notice equations that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them, remember the story of Edmund Hartwell. Remember that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And that sometimes, the greatest mathematical discovery isn't a solution, but a question that changes the very nature of reality itself. Because in the end, Professor Hartwell didn't disappear into his blackboard. He became part of something larger, something that exists in the spaces between numbers, in the silence between calculations. In the moment when a mathematical truth becomes too beautiful and terrible for the human mind to fully comprehend, the teaching never stops. It just moves to dimensions we're not yet ready to understand.